There's a type of victory that doesn't make noise. No applause, no announcements, no pretty photos to prove anything to anyone. It happens when you close the door, take a deep breath, and decide to work on yourself without needing to be seen. And that, for a lot of people, is the hardest part. Because the world has taught us that if nobody notices, it doesn't count. That if nobody validates it, you don't exist. That if there's no recognition, it's a sign of failure. But maturity starts when you understand something uncomfortable. Other people's gaze changes, approval fluctuates, admiration is unstable, and if you build your life on top of that, you spend your whole life shaking. Growing in silence isn't disappearing out of fear. It's disappearing as a strategy. It's choosing dignity over the need to prove yourself. It's a form of self-control that doesn't depend on an audience. When you mature, you realize there's a hidden cost to always explaining yourself, showing off, defending yourself, trying to convince the world that you're evolving. That cost is dispersion. The energy that could turn into training, studying, discipline, and clarity turns into performance. And performance, no matter how pretty it looks, rarely sustains the spirit for long. Stoicism is tough and simple at the same time. You don't have control over what people say about you, what they expect from you, how they interpret your choices. But you do have control, if you train, over what you do when nobody's watching. And that's where life changes. Because what strengthens you isn't the image you project. It's the character you build. There's a common confusion. The person thinks they're seeking growth, but they're seeking applause. They change a little and already feel the need to announce it. They start a plan and already want to tell everyone. They learn something and already want to teach it. And there's nothing wrong with sharing experiences. The problem is when sharing turns into neediness, when validation becomes fuel. Because at that point, you're not working to become better. You're working to be seen as better. And that creates a dangerous cycle. If nobody notices, you get discouraged. If someone criticizes, you fall apart. If someone ignores you, you get offended. Life becomes hostage to an audience that's not always available. That's why silence is a discipline. It protects what's still fragile in you. It protects the beginning. It protects the seed. Every real process starts vulnerable. A habit change is unstable. A new thought hasn't turned into conviction yet. A new emotional stance hasn't turned into firmness yet. And if you expose it too soon, you put your process at risk. Not because others are bad, but because the world is noisy. Opinions come in, comparisons come in, expectations come in, and suddenly, what was intimate turns into competition. What was healing turns into proof. What was training turns into pride. And pride is an old enemy. It grows fast and falls even faster. Growing in silence also has to do with a type of emotional intelligence. You stop wasting energy trying to win arguments that go nowhere. You stop explaining your decisions to people who just want to be right. You learn not to hand over your peace to small provocations. The Stoics would call this inner freedom. The free person isn't the one who does whatever they want. It's the one who's not hijacked by impulses. It's the one who doesn't need to react to every stimulus, every comment, every provocation. And in times of constant exposure, that's almost a superpower. But there's emotional pain behind the noise. A lot of people talk too much, show too much, take stances too much because they're afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being invisible, afraid of not mattering. And that fear can have deep roots. A childhood where you had to draw attention to be noticed. An environment where you only got affection when you did something impressive. A history of rejection that left the feeling that if you don't prove yourself all the time, someone will abandon you. So silence seems dangerous, as if silence were synonymous with loneliness. But silence, when chosen, isn't loneliness. It's strength. Deep psychology would say there's a part in us that seeks recognition as a way to heal an old wound. And that's human. The problem starts when you try to heal internal wounds with external applause. Applause doesn't heal, it distracts. It gives momentary relief, but not foundation. Foundation comes from within, from the ability to sustain yourself, to respect yourself, to observe yourself with honesty, to train without dramatizing, to learn without humiliating yourself, to make mistakes without destroying yourself. And Stoicism at this point is almost a bitter medicine. Don't expect the world to be fair to you. Don't expect people to recognize your struggle. Don't expect life to give back exactly what you offered. Do what's right, because it's right. Train because you need to train. Learn because your mind needs clarity. Adjust your habits because your life needs direction. And do it without depending on witnesses. Because when you depend on witnesses, you become vulnerable to the public's mood. When you don't depend, you become solid. There's a strange beauty in disappearing for a while. Not disappearing as escape, but as retreat. Like going into a silent workshop to rebuild the loose parts. Whoever chooses this starts to notice something surprising. The world keeps turning without you. Conversations continue, opinions continue, judgments continue. And that, at first, can hurt. The ego screams, "You're falling behind." But over time, you realize the opposite. You're coming back to yourself. You're stepping out of the showcase and into the temple. Stepping out of the noise and into the axis. Training in silence is a form of practical humility. You stop imagining yourself as the protagonist in other people's gaze and go back to being the protagonist of your own character. You take care of your body without turning it into vanity. You study without turning it into superiority. You improve your way of speaking without turning it into a spectacle. You learn to say no without announcing that you've learned to say no. You just live. And there's a rare elegance in someone who doesn't need to narrate their own evolution. And at the same time, silence also reveals. When you remove the noise, some truths appear. You notice where you're anxious, where you're needy, where you're irritated, where you're fragile, and you also notice where you're truly strong. True strength isn't the kind that shows off. It's the kind that sustains. It's the kind that gets through a tough day without turning everything into drama. It's the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. It's the kind that works, learns, improves, and lets the results speak over time. Because time is a more honest judge than public opinion. Public opinion is immediate, superficial, volatile. Time reveals consistency. Time reveals discipline. Time reveals who really changed and who just performed change. And Stoicism has that flavor. It trusts habits more than speeches, more in posture than promises, more in repeating the good than in momentary emotion. If you're in a moment where you feel like retreating, training more and talking less, maybe it's not a sign of weakness. Maybe it's maturity arriving. Life sometimes calls us to silence like it's calling for a reorganization. And that doesn't have to be sad. It can be sacred. Because it's in silence that you start to hear yourself clearly. And when you hear clearly, you decide firmly. There's a point in life where you realize that most of what's worth building doesn't come under bright lights. It comes in the dark, in the repetitive everyday, in the hour when nobody's watching. And that goes against a very common human need. The need to be noticed. Because being noticed seems to confirm you're on the right path. But external confirmation is unstable fuel. One day it comes, the next it doesn't. One day they praise, the next they ignore. And when you get used to depending on it, you become hostage to a rhythm you don't control. Stoicism has always insisted on a simple, almost harsh idea. Your life is your responsibility, not a spectacle. What makes you better isn't what you say about yourself, but what you do when you're alone. And that's where real discipline starts, in the hour when you don't have an audience to sustain your motivation, in the hour when you need to choose between immediate comfort and slow building, in the hour when the mind invents sophisticated excuses to justify laziness, vice, excess, escape. Training without witnesses is facing that internal theater, and that internal theater is more intense than many imagine. There are days when you don't want to study, days when you don't want to take care of your body, days when you don't want to have patience with your own mind. And on those days, it's not inspiration that saves you. It's habit. Habit is a kind of silent structure that sustains you when emotion fails. The Stoics didn't put hope in emotion. They put it in practice, in repetition, in doing what's needed with serenity, even when the body and mind want the easier path. But there's a modern trap. The person confuses discipline with aggression. They try to change by hating themselves, try to train as punishment, try to study as escape from guilt. And then, no matter how much they do, something sours inside. Because the motor is toxic. That's not discipline, it's internal war. Stoic discipline is different. It comes from self-respect. From understanding that you have duties to yourself. That your body isn't an enemy to be tamed with cruelty, but an instrument that needs care. That your mind isn't a field for constant humiliation, but a place to be educated with firmness. What makes training in silence powerful is that it cleans the motivation. When you train to appear, you train to be admired. And sooner or later, that creates vanity and anxiety. You start measuring your worth by visible results. Start comparing. Start proving yourself. And the training that should free you turns into another prison. But when you train away from the noise, the focus changes. You train to become capable. Train for self-control. Train to sustain your own life with more stability. Train not to be dominated by impulses. That has another density. And it's at this point that a lot of people discover an uncomfortable truth. Most of life won't give you applause. Most effort will go unnoticed. You'll do right things that nobody notices. Resist temptations nobody sees. Swallow words that could destroy relationships. Maintain a dignified posture on days when you could get revenge, yell, abandon, and nobody will hand you a medal for it. But it's exactly that which builds a rare kind of peace. You start to respect yourself in silence. Self-respect is an intimate currency. You don't buy it with approval. You buy it with coherence. Every time you promise something to yourself and follow through, even small, you increase your internal confidence. Every time you betray yourself, you lose a bit of that confidence. And the worst kind of insecurity isn't the one from external criticism. It's the one from knowing deep down that you can't count on yourself. Training in silence is rebuilding that confidence. It's saying, without words, I'm here, I won't abandon myself. But there's a big obstacle. The ego wants quick recognition. It wants visible signs to ease the anxiety. That's why many people tell their plans before realizing them. Because telling gives a sense of completion, gives a sense of identity. Now I'm someone who does such a thing. But the brain often confuses talk with action. You announce and feel relief as if you'd already done it. And that relief decreases the urgency of real work. Silence, on the contrary, keeps the energy concentrated. You don't spend force proving. You spend force building. There's also a strategic dimension. The more you expose what you're starting, the more vulnerable you become to interferences. People who mock, people who advise without being asked, people who project fear, people who compare, people who set expectations. Even when intentions are good, the effect can be bad. Your mind starts carrying the other's gaze, and the other's gaze weighs. Silence removes that weight. It lets the process breathe. Stoicism calls this internal self-sufficiency, not in the sense of arrogance, but in the sense of not depending on the world to stay firm. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself, constantly reinforced the idea of returning to one's own center, of not letting yourself be dragged by opinions, of doing what must be done with simplicity. That simplicity is a form of power, because the world tries to pull you out all the time. Notifications, disputes, vanities, fears, invented urgencies. Growing in silence is returning inside and saying, I choose the essential. And the essential is often boring. It's repetitive. It's doing the basics well. Sleeping better, eating with more awareness, training with consistency, reading and studying without romanticizing, saving money, cutting excesses, avoiding useless fights, fixing what's broken at home, inside yourself. The adult part of life is like that, no spectacle. And that's why the ego flees. It wants the intense sensation, the dramatic turn, the cinematic moment. But whoever waits for the cinematic moment usually loses decades. Whoever accepts the basics well done, silently, builds. There's also the emotional dimension. Growing in silence requires enduring being misunderstood. Because when you retreat, some people will say you're distant. They'll assume you're proud. They'll create narratives. They'll miss your available energy. And you'll need to tolerate that without explaining too much. That's a tough training. Keeping your path without needing everyone to understand. The Stoics would say, you don't control the external narrative. You control your rectitude, and that's enough. Another thing silence does is reveal your real internal companions. When you don't have others' noise, you hear your own voices. And then two characters appear, the critic and the saboteur. The critic says, "You're not doing enough." The saboteur says, "It's not worth it." And both can throw you off balance. Training in silence is learning not to obey either automatically. It's observing those thoughts as phenomena, not truths. It's responding with firmness. I continue. Not out of anger, not out of despair, but out of commitment. The word commitment here is central. Commitment is what remains when emotion varies, and mature life is made of that. Commitments you sustain even when not inspired. The young person, or emotionally immature, lives on impulse. The mature person lives on direction. And direction comes from values. You train because you value health and self-control. You learn because you value clarity and mental freedom. You step away from the noise because you value peace and focus. That's being governed by what's greater in you, not what's noisiest in you. And perhaps the greatest fruit of training without witnesses is this. You start to like your own company. Not because everything's resolved, but because you stop running from yourself. You start to know yourself. Start to notice your triggers. Start to notice your needs. Start to notice your vanities. And instead of denying, you work. Silently. With patience. Like someone renovating an old house, knowing some walls will be hard work. But it's worth it because it's where you live. Yourself. There's a type of dignity that comes when you refuse to live to prove. You start living to build. And real building doesn't need announcement, it needs repetition, one day after another, small choices, courage to continue when nobody's looking. There's a huge difference between stepping away from the noise and isolating from the world. Isolation is escape. Strategic withdrawal is mental hygiene. When you decide to learn and disappear for a while, you're not giving up on people or abandoning life. You're just interrupting a cycle that sucks energy. The cycle of reacting to everything, justifying to everyone, comparing to everybody. And that cycle is a silent thief. It doesn't just steal hours, it steals identity. Because when you live reactive, yourself becomes a response to external pressures, not a conscious construction. Stoicism treats this as a principle of inner sovereignty. The world will always have noise, opinions, judgments, disputes, trends, urgencies, scandals. If you let yourself be carried by that flow, you become a piece of wood in the river, going where the current takes you. Stoic training is the opposite. You learn to be a boat. And the boat doesn't ignore the current, but isn't dragged by it either. It chooses direction. It adjusts the sails. It respects the weather, but doesn't dissolve in it. Disappearing is often that adjustment, leaving the river of opinion and entering the sea of your own purpose. But doing this requires something a lot of people don't admit: courage to be misunderstood. Because absence creates narratives. When you reduce presence, someone thinks you're angry. When you don't respond quickly, someone concludes you're arrogant. When you stop explaining, someone assumes you're hiding something, and the impulse to defend is strong. The ego wants to rush to clean the image, wants to fix others' understanding. But the Stoic learns a difficult move. He allows the other to think what they want as long as he remains faithful to his own character. And that's not coldness. It's soul economy. There are arguments you win and still lose something more precious: peace. There are explanations you give and still realize the other didn't want to understand. They just wanted to be right. When you learn not to explain to those unwilling to comprehend, you discover a type of freedom. The freedom not to live in court. The freedom not to make life a permanent debate. Learning in this context isn't just accumulating information. It's building internal structure. It's training the mind to be less impulsive, less resentful, less anxious. It's learning to distinguish facts from interpretations. It's learning to perceive when you're defending out of pride and when you're standing out of dignity. It's learning to deal with frustrations without turning everything into drama. And that learning almost always happens better in silence because silence gives space for reflection. External noise creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that you're in on everything, You consume news, opinions, analyses, discussions, and feel like you're participating. But participation isn't construction. The digital world offers movement, but not depth automatically. Depth requires pause, requires concentration, requires facing your own ignorance without shame, requires studying without needing to beat anyone, requires learning to change life, not to win a dispute. There's also an emotional trap, learning to feel superior. Sometimes the person studies philosophy, psychology, spirituality, and uses it as armor. They don't transform, they protect. They stay right on the outside, but remain confused inside. Stoicism, when genuine, doesn't turn into intellectual vanity. It turns into moral discipline. It demands coherence, not discourse. It asks you, are you calmer, fairer, more sober, more able to bear frustration? Or did you just learn pretty words? That's why disappearing can be the cure for a subtle type of vanity, the vanity of being seen as someone evolving. When you retreat, you lose that mirror. And without a mirror, you find the truth. You notice where you're still trying to impress, where you're still competing, where you're still proving. And that perception at first can be uncomfortable, because it shows how much of your effort was performative. But that discomfort is valuable. It clears the path. There's a practical reason for this. The energy you use to maintain an image is the same energy you need to grow, and energy is limited. If you spend your energy trying to seem strong, little is left to become strong. If you spend energy trying to seem wise, little is left to learn. If you spend energy trying to seem disciplined, little is left to train. Silence returns energy. It cuts waste. It reduces the need to be present in everything. And with that, it increases your capacity to deepen. Another crucial point, disappearing requires accepting that not everyone will follow your process. Some people like your old version, predictable, available, reactive. When you start changing, you stop serving certain dynamics. You stop being the one who agrees with everything. Stop being the one who always justifies. Stop being the one who enters the emotional game. And that bothers. Some people try to pull you back with irony, guilt, provocations. And here, Stoicism offers a firm posture. You don't need to attack. You don't need to humiliate. You don't need to prove. You just keep the course. The best response, often, is constancy. True learning also involves a type of intellectual humility, the awareness that you don't know as much as you thought. That's good. It's a sign of growth. The mature mind loses a bit of arrogance and gains precision. It learns to say, I don't know, without shame, learns to ask better questions, learns to listen without turning everything into competition, and that humility is almost impossible in noisy environments, because noise demands quick position, ready opinion, instant response. Silence, on the contrary, allows maturation. You can read slowly, can reflect, can write to yourself, can review convictions, can change your mind without needing to justify. And that brings us to an essential idea. Disappearing isn't vanishing from the world. It's vanishing from the need to react to the world. It's turning off the radar that seeks threat in every phrase. It's stopping living in a state of social alert, because a lot of people live like that. Any message becomes a threat. Any absence becomes rejection. Any criticism becomes condemnation. And then the person wears themselves out interpreting signals all the time. Growing in silence is recovering attention, directing focus to what really builds life. There's a powerful Stoic exercise here. When something provokes you, you ask, is this a fact or an interpretation? Does this hurt my dignity or just my vanity? Does this require action or serenity? These questions prevent you from reacting like a reflex. And disappearing, in the deepest sense, is this: not being a reflex of the world, being a conscious presence. Over time, whoever practices this starts to notice a change. Silence stops being empty and becomes strength. You no longer feel the need to tell everything. You don't feel the need to always explain. You don't feel the need to prove you're right. You start living with more interiority. And interiority is a rare wealth, because it gives you ground, gives you stability, gives you direction. When external life shakes, and it always shakes, you don't crumble as easily, because you weren't hanging on anyone's opinion. And learning here includes something few value: learning to bear discomfort without distracting yourself. The world offers infinite distractions: videos, discussions, shopping, comparisons, small pleasures, and all that can turn into escape. Stoicism teaches to stay with the discomfort for a while, observing, breathing, without despairing. Because that training strengthens your mind. A strong mind isn't one that never suffers, it's one that doesn't surrender to impulse, that crosses through. When you retreat, study, train, and disappear from the noise, something surprising can happen. You become more selective with what you allow in. You start choosing better conversations, better content, better people, better habits. You stop contaminating yourself as much. And that's a form of spirit protection. Not out of fear of the world, but out of respect for your own focus. Silence then becomes a kind of internal pact. I don't owe my energy to chaos. And that pact changes everything. Because chaos always asks for your attention, always asks for your reaction, always asks for your indignation. But you don't need to offer yourself as food to chaos. You can choose to grow elsewhere. In the simple, the constant, the deep. Deep down, growing in silence is a decision of war, but an internal, refined war, where you choose not to waste ammunition on small battles. You stop fighting to be understood by those who don't want to comprehend. Stop fighting to be admired by those who only know envy. Stop fighting to maintain an image that requires too much effort. And then, little by little, something rare happens. You get energy back for what really matters. Not nervous energy, the kind that comes from anxiety and hurry. Clean energy. Energy from someone who knows what they're doing and why. Stoicism points to an uncomfortable but liberating truth. Life doesn't owe you recognition. The world doesn't sign a receipt for your effort. People don't always notice your discipline, your improvement, your change in posture. And when you accept that without bitterness, you become dangerous in the best sense. Dangerous to your own vices, to your own excuses, to your own impulses. Because you no longer need applause to continue. You continue because you decided to be someone reliable to yourself. That's the big turn. Most people try to strengthen themselves by seeking external signs that they're doing well. But real strengthening comes when you learn to evaluate yourself from within. You start measuring your evolution by intimate criteria. Am I calmer, firmer, less reactive? Can I bear a no without collapsing? Can I cross a tough day without turning everything into drama? Can I say the truth with respect? Can I stay silent without feeling like I'm disappearing out of fear? That kind of measurement is cruel to the ego and kind to the soul. Because it doesn't depend on the audience. It depends on consciousness. And consciousness, for the Stoics, is daily discipline. Not a moment of enlightenment. It's the commitment to repeat the essential when nobody's watching. Choose what's worthy. Avoid what's degrading. Train the body. Train the mind. Correct the character. Life, over time, responds to this in a discreet way. You gain stability, gain serenity, gain focus. And even when everything outside oscillates, you don't get lost as easily. Because your center isn't hanging on praises, likes, approval, or understanding. Your center is planted. Disappearing, in this sense, becomes a kind of purification. You step away from certain conversations not out of contempt, but hygiene. Step away from certain disputes, not out of cowardice, but respect for your time and spirit. Step away from certain people not out of hate, but because you realize there are environments that spoil what you're trying to build. And that requires courage, because the world will interpret in its way. It always has. It always will. The Stoic learns not to be governed by others' interpretations. He learns to be governed by values. And when you live like that, there's a silent gain that nobody gives you as a gift: self-respect. Self-respect doesn't come from speeches, nor promises, nor intentions. It comes from coherence, from you looking at yourself and knowing you're doing what needs to be done, even with fear, even with laziness, even without desire, even without audience. That kind of coherence gives a ground that the world can't easily rip away, because it's not borrowed ground, it's yours. Maybe you're in a life moment where talking too much doesn't help anymore, where explaining tires you, where proving something became an addiction. If that's the case, the answer might be simpler than it seems. Reduce the noise, increase the focus, choose a training and sustain it, choose a skill and deepen it, choose a habit and repeat it. And guard the process like guarding a flame from the wind, not out of superstition but wisdom. Exposed flame goes out easy, protected flame grows. In the end, the world usually respects results, but you don't owe your path to the world's respect. You owe your path to your own life, to your health, to your mind, to your dignity. And there's a very particular peace when you understand that the most valuable growth is the one that doesn't need to be announced. It shows in your calmer gaze, in your firmer speech, in your more willing body, in your capacity not to react to small provocations, in your skill to say no without anger, in your constancy. The world might even take time to notice, but you notice, and that's enough. If this content made sense to you, leave a like to help the video reach more people. Write in the comments which area of your life you feel you need to grow in silence. Habits, discipline, studies, emotions, relationships, or career. And subscribe to the channel to follow more Stoic reflections, practical and deep, aimed at strengthening character and bringing more serenity to everyday life. Share with someone who lives tired of proving themselves all the time. Sometimes what the person needs isn't more noise but a firmer path.